joining me on the program now to comment more on this story and some of the issues it raises. Brendan Malone from LifeNET. Brendan, kia ora, thanks for your time today.
Great to be back with you as always, Andrew.
Now, look, I don't want to mention the word that was used. I don't even want to mention the letter that it started with. However, Andrea Vance, who is a senior reporter with Stuff, published an article, and Stuff made the decision to publish it, which included an extremely offensive word, and I think just about all New Zealanders would recognise it as one of the most offensive words in the English language to describe a senior politician, and Stuff says, yep, that's fair enough, we'll let you publish that. I think I'm more shocked and appalled at the response of the media organisation than the use of the word.
Yeah, and you're actually right about that, I think. Look, we can understand how maybe someone in the heat of the moment who just sort of gets really angry about something and the filter drops and they just say something silly.
Yep.
But the fact that it was submitted and accepted by senior editors, their job surely is to be the filter when someone perhaps is just a little bit hot-headed and say, hey, let's calm that down a bit. And that didn't happen. And then what's even worse, I think, now is that they are actively defending it.
Yeah.
And they are claiming, in the New Zealand Herald yesterday, they were interviewed about it. And the Stuff management and editors said, look, we think in this context it's appropriate. The only context was a journalist was angry at a politician, and so they just abused them in the most heinous way they could. That's not context. That's just someone who's angry. I've also seen subsequent to that yesterday someone who actually made a complaint to them, wrote a formal complaint, and I've seen the reply that this person has received, and it's even worse.
Wow.
It really is. It's quite a lengthy reply, and they really are. They're very much, it shows a lot of political tribalism, a lack of balance, and basically they're saying, well, we don't think it's that offensive, so we're okay saying these kinds of things.
Now, definitions of journalism, I suppose. I mean, not all journalism is equal, of course. I think that's pretty self-evident. But to say that this is a publication, yes, this was an opinion piece, but to describe an angry rant and name-calling as any type of journalism which actually brings, well, this is an ample demonstration of more heat than light to the conversation, and not explaining what is a complex political and financial situation.
Yeah, ironically, as others have pointed out, it also undermines the cause. If you're trying to represent these voiceless women in caring professions, then you've done the worst thing you could, because everyone's now fixated on the obscenities that you uttered rather than the actual issue itself. And also the fact that, I mean, the reality is that this is about, and coming from a publication which has previously spent a lot of time talking about and decrying the loss of social cohesion in New Zealand. And yet here we have senior journalists in a major publication who are actively contributing to the undermining and the degrading of the public discourse in New Zealand, and that is not good. This is one of the reasons why, Andrew, I think I was actually thinking about this, and I don't mean this in a trite way, or I'm not trying to sort of pander at all, but I really think Rhema, for example, has a valuable contribution in this space, because you can have the conversations we're having about big and controversial and even sometimes very fraught and challenging issues, and we can disagree, but it's always done within that spirit of Christian humility and Christian charity. And even when we cross a boundary, we always recognise we've done that, and we should repent and say sorry for it. And I think that's so fundamental to a healthy, humane society.
But perhaps Andrea Vance needs a thesaurus. Perhaps she couldn't think of another word to say what she wanted to express.
Some time at Rhema, maybe.
Well, exactly. And honestly, I'm not sure that word's in the dictionary or the thesaurus, because publishing standards are usually higher than that. But I want to move on from the circus that this has created and jump into, I suppose, the moral issue of paying people fairly, because as you say, this is the crying shame that this issue isn't being treated seriously, because we've got a little bit of a sideshow and some politicians doing some name calling, and it's all a bit of a smokescreen as we head to the budget. The issue of whether or not people in society, be they male, female, New Zealand born or part of our immigrant community, that they are paid fairly for the work that they do, surely this should be at the heart of the issue.
Well, that's it. One of the big concerns I have about this is I feel like it's being masked in a sort of politically, ideologically loaded debate around gender. And it's a very fraught thing when you look at the what's often called the gender pay gap, because the way it's often presented, people wrongly assume, as I initially did, that what was actually being exposed here was women in the same profession with the same experience and qualifications were being paid less than their male counterparts. That's not what it actually means. It's referring to over their lifetime, their total earnings, and often also if they're in certain professions that aren't paid as well. So to me, the bigger question here is not just focusing on political categories like, they call it gendered work, for example, or feminized work I've seen. We need to focus on the question of work in general. Does the work we do and the way we pay and compensate people for that work, does it represent a authentically Christian understanding of human dignity? Mm-hmm. Is there dignity in the work? Is there dignity in what people are being paid? And what do we value and why? Can you really, you can't. I'll answer my own question. You can't convince me that a prime minister, no matter how good they are, is doing work that is worth, 6 or 7 times probably the average annual wage of someone who is caring for our dying, vulnerable elderly. Yeah. I'm not going to be convinced of that. I think what we've got to do is start saying and taking a more communal approach where we actually say, rather than just this brutal, cold market economics, you pay what people are willing to pay, we say, well, hold on a minute, shouldn't we actually respect the human dignity of people and ensure that they can live well and have families and own homes and all those kind of very basic kinds of things that build a humane and just society?
And when it comes to the comparison, because I think there's, and this is some of the fishhooks with the legislation, that perhaps starting out well-meaning to make sure that people received sufficient remuneration for their work and people in society weren't disadvantaged for something which is outside of their control. However, this comparison of categories, should somebody who's a librarian be paid the same amount as somebody who is a drain layer, for example? I don't understand market economics to know the answer to that question, but it seems a little bit complicated. Perhaps a more important question: is there a glass wall? Is there a barrier for people who want the higher wages that perhaps a drain layer gets compared to a librarian? Is there a barrier for people being able to enter these higher wage positions? Is there a glass ceiling in some places where people, because of their gender or their background, aren't able to earn or be as successful as others, rather than say, no, we have to pay librarians exactly the same amount as we need to pay people in this category, seems to be, swallowing camels and straining gnats?
Well, it's an interesting one, actually. It's a much bigger question in that regard as well. And I think you're right. One thing you're talking about there is economic mobility, and that has definitely declined. Everything I'm reading is indicating that is the case. And what economic mobility means is, like, if you're in a lower paying situation, you're not earning as much, economic mobility is the ability to say, you know what, I'm going to retrain, or I'm going to take a new profession and I'm going to earn more. I'm going to work a bit harder and I will actually earn a bit more. Yeah. That ability to shift in that direction upwards, that is decreasing. The ladders are being pulled up all over the place, and that's a problem. Housing prices are another major factor in all of this. Yeah. Even if you get a good job, how do you have a family and pay a mortgage now on an average home? It's becoming obscenely absurd. And then, of course, there is the bigger question, and really Christianity, I think, would want to get into this, and that's the question of, well, like you sort of raised, I mean, ultimately, everyone can't be a drain layer. Yeah. Everyone can't be the Prime Minister. Everyone can't be a librarian either. Yeah. So the reality is, are they doing something fundamentally dignified and that is contributing to the life of our community and the common good? And if they are, don't they have the basic right just to earn enough of a living, to buy a house, to feed their family, to clothe themselves, to live a basic flourishing human life? And I don't think we're ready for that question in society yet, because we've built a whole view of the world around liberal economics rather than perhaps a Christian vision, which tends to be more communal in nature, which would reject both communism, so collectivism, and the extremes of individualism.
I mean, hey, let's stick with my metaphor for a moment. Honestly, regardless of my gender, I'd rather be a librarian than a drain layer, because I'm not sure I've got the knees for it. And I don't want my body worn out before I retire, honestly. And even if there was a lower wage to be a librarian, I would rather have the flexibility that would allow me for other things that are important to me in life. And I think there is, I suppose, getting into the gendered debate on this one, perhaps this is an aspect of society, that there are some people who make choices to say, you know what, I don't care about the wages.
Yeah.
being with my family is more important, and this applies to men and women. And so I'm happy to take a lower wage. And honestly, if that's a person's choice and they have the freedom to be able to do that, why should the taxpayer subsidize the wage negotiation so that those people have to get at the same rate as somebody who's prepared to do more physical work, perhaps?
Yeah, I think you're right. If someone's making a genuine free and open choice where they have the ability to do that, I think increasingly that choice is not really on the table for a lot of people, though. And there's just that, as I said, the price of housing, for example, creates financial desperation, among other things.
Yeah.
The fact that we haven't had enough children means we've got an aging population. It puts more of a burden on healthcare and social systems, and we have less taxpayers coming in to pay for that. But I think, it's a fascinating question. What's also interesting in this is the way that it's often misrepresented. For example, in the Nordic countries where females have the least limits and the most ability to freely choose whichever career path they want, what does the data show us? They still choose to be nurses and teachers and go into the caring professions. There's something about the feminine genius that is drawn to that. They don't really want to go into STEM. And so there's this interesting dynamic then that does enter the picture. Well, how do we value work? And what are we basing that value, that utility upon? And I think that's a much deeper and bigger question. And you're right. If someone's making a free choice, that's one thing. And in many ways, you'd say that person has done a very wise thing to give themselves more time with family and even perhaps for service of the church, etc., than just seeking after, money and gold and everything else that doesn't satisfy. But at the same time, there is that big pressing economic burden of how are we going to be able to afford? And like I said, when we haven't had enough kids, how are we going to be able to afford even things like the pension? These are big looming questions, and politicians are desperately scrambling to try and fix them.
And hey, let's have a civic and a civil discourse about this one. Let's have conversations about this very important aspect about some of the structure of society and the way in which we care for each other without resorting to name calling and using some very rude words. I think, Brendan.
Amen to that.
Hey, thank you for the work that you do. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Great to be here as always, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.